On the night of February 4th, 1984, 14 people died in a warehouse fire on Chicago's South Side. All young men, all members of the same street crew. The method was deliberate arson, doors chained from the outside, gasoline poured through ventilation shafts, a single match dropped into darkness. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs from across the city, weren't drug cartel enforcers, weren't professional hitmen. They were 4 members of the Moretti family, a father and his 3 sons, who ran a trucking business in the same neighborhood where their victims had grown up. The Chicago Fire Department would later call it one of the most calculated mass killings in the city's history. But the reason behind the inferno wasn't a drug war, wasn't retaliation for a murder, wasn't even about territory. It was an $85,000 shipment of contraband cigarettes stolen from a warehouse loading dock. And one man's unshakable belief that respect, once lost, demanded an answer written in fire. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. The South Side Industrial Corridor stretched along 35th Street like a concrete canyon of broken dreams in 1984. The district covered roughly 8 square miles, home to approximately 200,000 people, most of them working-class families, Italian, Irish, Polish, Mexican, and increasingly Puerto Rican and African American populations, pushed south and west by housing project demolitions. The area was bounded by the Dan Ryan Expressway to the west, Lake Michigan to the east, sprawling from 26th Street down to 51st, where rows of warehouses, trucking depots, and manufacturing plants stood like tombstones, marking the death of American industry. Population density meant everyone knew everyone's business. But somehow people remained strangers, divided by invisible lines, drawn in blood and history and old grudges nobody could quite remember starting. The winter of 1984 hit Chicago with particular cruelty. February temperatures hovered around 15 degrees during the day, dropping below 0 at night when wind came screaming off Lake Michigan with a bite that went through your heaviest coat and settled in your bones. The street smelled like diesel exhaust from idling trucks, hot grease from the taqueria on 33rd Street, and underneath it all, the metallic scent of old machinery slowly rusting in warehouses that used to run 3 shifts and now sat mostly empty. At night, when temperatures really dropped, you could hear the city settling. Ice cracking in gutters, wind rattling chain-link fences topped with barbed wire, the distant clatter of the Orange Line elevated train making its endless loop through neighborhoods most Chicagoans had forgotten existed. Sound traveled strange in that industrial landscape. Sometimes you'd hear a truck backing up 2 blocks away, its warning beeps sharp and clear. Other times you wouldn't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you, his footsteps swallowed by the ambient hum of transformers and ventilation systems that never stopped running. But 1984 wasn't just another brutal Chicago winter. The city was hemorrhaging manufacturing jobs at a rate that made the Great Depression look gentle by comparison. Reagan's policies had accelerated the collapse of American industry. Steel mills that had employed thousands now sat abandoned, their blast furnaces cold, their parking lots empty, except for broken glass and weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. Wisconsin Steel had closed in 1980. Republic Steel followed in '83. By February 1984, unemployment in Chicago's industrial corridors hovered around 38%. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives working with their hands, building things, moving things, making America run, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families except disability checks that barely covered rent and food stamps, that bought humiliation at checkout counters. In that economic wasteland, some families turned to what they'd always done on the side. The legitimate businesses, trucking companies, warehouses, loading docks became fronts for moving contraband. Cigarettes from states with lower taxes, stolen goods, occasionally drugs, though the old Italian families tried to avoid that poison. The infrastructure was already there. The trucks, the connections, the routes. And the police, understaffed and underpaid, had bigger problems than cigarette smuggling when gang violence was turning whole neighborhoods into war zones. The Moretti warehouse sat on a corner lot at 35th and Morgan, a 2-story brick building constructed in 1923 when Chicago still believed in its industrial future. The building covered half a city block, 20,000 square feet of loading docks, storage space, and a second-floor office that overlooked the entire operation. Moretti Trucking, the sign read, established 1923, though the paint had faded until you could barely read it against the weathered brick. 3 delivery trucks were usually parked in the gated lot behind the building, white Fords with the company name stenciled on their sides, legitimate vehicles for legitimate work that happened during daylight hours. The neighborhood around the warehouse was dying slowly. Half the buildings on Morgan Street sat empty, their windows broken or boarded up, graffiti covering brick walls in layers that told the story of shifting gang territories. The bodega 2 blocks south had been robbed 6 times in the past year. The auto repair shop across the street operated behind roll-down steel shutters even during business hours. People walked quickly here, eyes down, not making eye contact. Everyone understanding that this was transitional space where old rules were breaking down and new ones hadn't been established yet. But the Moretti building maintained an aura of permanence. The gate was always locked unless trucks were loading or unloading. Security lights blazed from all 4 corners at night. And most importantly, everyone in the neighborhood knew that the Morettis weren't people you crossed. Not because they were flashy or violent by nature, but because they represented something older than the current chaos. A connection to when this neighborhood had codes and structures and everyone knew exactly where they stood. February 4th, 1984, dawned gray and bitter. The temperature at 6 in the morning was 7 degrees, but the wind chill made it feel like 20 below. Ice covered the sidewalks in sheets. The sky was that particular pale gray that promised more snow, even though the forecasters said clear. The air tasted like coal smoke from buildings still using ancient heating systems, mixed with the sharp chemical smell of diesel fuel and the underlying rot of a city that couldn't afford to pick up garbage as regularly as it once had. The death of Chicago's industrial corridor hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow strangulation that started in the 1970s and accelerated through the early 80s. For generations, the South Side had been built on manufacturing. Men graduated high school, sometimes didn't even finish, and walked into union jobs that paid enough to buy a house, raise a family, send kids to Catholic school. The steel mills, the factories, the warehouses, they weren't just employers. They were the entire social structure. The unions provided health care, pensions, identity. Your father had worked at Wisconsin Steel, his father before him. That's who you were. By 1984, that entire world had collapsed. The factories that remained ran skeleton crews. The unions, once powerful enough to shut down entire industries, were broken. Companies had moved operations overseas or to the South where labor was cheaper and regulations were non-existent. The men who'd spent 30 years breathing steel dust, breaking their bodies for wages, found themselves discarded. Too old to retrain for service economy jobs nobody wanted anyway. Too proud to accept charity, too angry to accept what had happened without someone paying for it. The numbers told the story. In 1979, the Southside Industrial District employed over 40,000 people in manufacturing. By 1984, that number had dropped to less than 12,000. The ripple effects destroyed everything. Businesses closed when customers couldn't afford to shop. Banks foreclosed on mortgages. Schools lost funding when property values collapsed. Crime exploded when young men realized there was no legal path to the lives their fathers had lived. Into this vacuum came new players, the traditional organized crime families. The Italians who'd run gambling and loan sharking for decades found themselves competing with street gangs that didn't respect old boundaries. The housing project demolitions had scattered thousands of families across the South Side, bringing gang affiliations and feuds into neighborhoods that had been relatively stable. The old hierarchical structures, the made men and capos and chains of command, meant nothing to 19-year-olds with automatic weapons and nothing to lose. Violence became expressive rather than instrumental. It wasn't about business anymore. It was about respect, about reputation, about not appearing weak, because weakness meant you'd be next. Salvatore Anthony Moretti was 56 years old that February, though he looked closer to 65. He stood 6 feet tall, but walked with a slight forward lean, his shoulders rounded from decades of lifting, loading, hauling. His face was all hard angles, cheekbones prominent, jaw square, skin weathered like old concrete from years of Chicago weather. A thick scar ran along his right forearm, a souvenir from a loading accident in 1967, when a pallet of steel pipes had shifted and caught him wrong. His hair had gone completely gray, cut short, and combed straight back without any attempt at style. His most distinctive feature was his eyes, dark brown, almost black, with a way of looking at you that made grown men remember they had somewhere else to be. But it was Salvatore's hands that told his real story. They were massive, knuckles swollen with arthritis that made cold mornings an exercise in pain management, fingers thick and calloused from decades of manual labor. The nails were permanently stained with grease and dirt that no amount of scrubbing could remove. A finger on his left hand was crooked, broken years ago, and never set properly, healed at an angle. When he shook your hand, you felt the strength there despite his age, but also the damage. Every morning started the same way. Salvatore woke at 4:30 in the small brick house on 33rd Street, that his father had bought in 1946 paid off over 20 years of warehouse work. He'd make coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, Medaglia d'Oro, never the cheap brands, strong enough to strip paint. He'd sit at the kitchen table in the dark, smoking unfiltered Camels, and plan his day in silence. No radio, no television, just the sound of the house settling around him and his own thoughts. By 5:30, he'd be out the door, walking the 4 blocks to the warehouse regardless of weather. Salvatore had 3 sons, and each morning they arrived at the warehouse by 6, following patterns established since they were old enough to carry boxes. Dominic Anthony Moretti was 31 that February, the eldest, standing 6'2", with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's dark eyes. He'd been working the warehouse since he was 14, knew every inch of the operation, every route, every customer, every cop who needed paying. Dominic was the strategist, quiet like his father, always thinking 3 moves ahead. He wore his hair longer than Sal approved of, had a thick mustache, dressed in flannel shirts and work boots that had seen a decade of use. His hands were already starting to show the arthritis that plagued his father. A wedding ring on his left hand, married to Angela Russo for 9 years. 2 daughters he kept as far from the business as possible. Marco Joseph Moretti was 28, the middle son, built thicker and stronger than Dominic. 5'11", but 220 pounds of muscle from loading trucks and unloading freight since he was 15. Where Dominic was calculation, Marco was action. He had their father's temper, quick to anger, but also quick to forgive. His nose had been broken twice, once in a bar fight when he was 21, once when a loading door had swung back and caught him wrong. He wore a leather jacket even in the warehouse, jeans so worn they were white at the knees, boots with steel toes. Marco wasn't married, lived in an apartment 3 blocks from the warehouse, dated a girl named Teresa who worked at the bank on Ashland Avenue, but never brought her around the family business. Anthony Michael Moretti was 25, the youngest, and the one who looked least like he belonged in a warehouse. He stood 6 feet tall, lean rather than muscular, with softer features that came from his mother's side. He'd graduated from community college, had worked briefly as an accountant before Sal called him back to handle the books. Anthony wore button-down shirts under sweaters, kept his hair neat, his hands cleaner than his brother's. He was engaged to a girl named Marie Catalano, planning a wedding for that summer. Of the 3 sons, Anthony was the only one who'd ever suggested there might be other ways to make money, legal ways. Dominic had laughed. Marco had called him soft. Sal had simply looked at him until Anthony stopped talking. The 3 brothers worked together with the efficiency of men who'd spent their lives in synchronized labor. Dominic handled logistics and scheduling. Marco supervised the loading crews. Anthony managed the accounts that were legitimate and the accounts that weren't. Salvatore's father, Giuseppe Moretti, had arrived at Ellis Island in 1921, 19 years old, with $8 in his pocket, and a cousin's address in Chicago. He'd worked the stockyards first, then found work loading trucks when a warehouse foreman needed men who wouldn't ask questions about what they were loading. By 1923, Giuseppe had saved enough to lease a small warehouse and start his own operation. Moretti Trucking moved legitimate freight during the day Other materials at night. Giuseppe had married Maria Benedetto in 1926, had one son, Salvatore, in 1928. He'd raised that son to understand that business had two faces, and the trick was keeping them separate enough that neither one destroyed the other. Salvatore had married Rosa Angela Lombardi in 1952, right after he'd come home from Korea with nightmares and a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer and never looked at. Rosa had been 18, beautiful, the daughter of another trucking family. They'd built their life in the same neighborhood where both had grown up, in the house Giuseppe bought them as a wedding present. Rosa had given him 3 sons and a daughter, Maria, who was now 29 and married to a lawyer in the suburbs. Rosa had died of breast cancer in 1982, 52 years old, after 18 months of treatments that had drained their savings and changed nothing. What Salvatore valued most wasn't money, though he needed it to survive. What he valued was respect. Not the kind of respect you could buy or that came from fear, though both had their uses. The respect that came from being a man who kept his word, who protected what was his, who understood that certain codes existed whether the law recognized them or not. His father had taught him that in America, you were only as good as your reputation. Lose that, and you had nothing. Let someone disrespect you, let them think they could take what was yours without consequence, and you might as well close the doors and walk away, because nobody would ever fear you again. The warehouse represented 4 generations of Moretti work. Giuseppe's initial lease payment saved nickel by nickel, the building purchase in 1947, the expansion in 1965, the trucks, the routes, the relationships with buyers and sellers that spanned decades. This wasn't just a business. It was identity, inheritance. The only thing of real value Salvatore had to pass to his sons in a world where men like them were becoming obsolete. By 1984, the old neighborhood structures had fractured. The Italian families that had run the South Side since Prohibition were aging, dying, losing control to younger, hungrier organizations that didn't respect the old boundaries. Salvatore's generation had grown up understanding that Chicago was divided. The Italians controlled certain industries. The Irish had others. The Polish, the Greeks. Everyone had their territories, their arrangements, their ways of coexisting without constant war. But the housing project demolitions had shattered those arrangements. Thousands of families, mostly Black and Puerto Rican, displaced when the city tore down Cabrini Green and Robert Taylor homes, had scattered across neighborhoods that weren't prepared to absorb them. Gang affiliations came with those families, old feuds and territories that meant nothing in new locations. The traditional organized crime families found themselves competing with street operations that had no hierarchy, no rules, no interest in the old ways of doing business. The outfit, Chicago's Italian mob, was weakened by federal prosecutions and internal power struggles. The vacuum created opportunities for anyone willing to take risks. Salvatore had watched his territory shrink year by year. Warehouses he'd used for storage, closed or taken over by younger crews, routes he'd run for decades, suddenly too dangerous when drivers got robbed at gunpoint. Buyers who dealt with Moretti Trucking for 20 years, now buying from whoever offered the lowest price with no loyalty to old relationships. But Salvatore had maintained his core territory through reputation. Everyone on the south side knew that the Moretti warehouse was untouchable. Not because Sal was connected to the outfit, though he had relationships. Not because he was particularly violent, though he'd done what was necessary over the years. But because he represented something older than the current chaos, a connection to when men settled disputes face to face, when your word meant something, when crossing certain lines had consequences everyone understood. The younger crews, the gangster disciples, the Latin kings, the vice lords, they left the Moretti operation alone, not out of respect exactly, but out of recognition that some wars weren't worth fighting, that some old men were dangerous, not despite their age, but because of everything they'd survived to reach it. Salvatore's code was simple. Do business honestly with honest people. Never steal from someone who trusts you. Always honor your debts. Protect your family above everything. And never, ever let disrespect go unanswered, because the moment you do, you're finished. Luis Ernesto Vasquez was 26 years old that February, though the streets had aged him until he looked closer to 40. He stood 5'9", stocky and powerful from years of physical labor before he'd decided there were easier ways to make money. His most distinctive feature was a burn scar that covered the left side of his neck, a souvenir from a fire in the projects when he was 12, trapped on the 4th floor until firefighters pulled him through a window. The scar had left the skin tight and shiny, pulling his face slightly to one side when he talked. Luis had grown up in the projects near 31st and State, one of 7 children raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who disappeared before Luis could remember him. He dropped out of high school in 10th grade, tried construction work, warehouse jobs, delivery driving, never lasting more than a few months before getting fired or quitting. By 1983, Luis had assembled a crew, not a gang in the traditional sense with colors and hierarchies and territories passed down through generations. Just 14 young men, teenagers, and 20-somethings, mostly Puerto Rican with a few Mexicans and one black kid named Marcus who'd grown up on the same block. They had no real leadership structure, no organization beyond Luis being the one who came up with ideas and the others following because they had nothing better to do. The crew hung around a bodega on 33rd Street, dealing small amounts of marijuana, occasionally stealing cars for chop shops, running errands for various organizations that needed disposable labor. They weren't particularly good at crime. Most of them had arrests. A few had done county jail time for theft or assault. But they were desperate, which made them dangerous in ways that professionals weren't. The crew included Luis's younger brother Carlos, 23, who followed Luis everywhere. Miguel Torres, 24, who'd done 3 years for armed robbery and come out harder. The Ortiz cousins, Rafael and Jose, both 21, inseparable since childhood. Marcus Washington, 22, the only non-Latino in the group, welcomed because he'd grown up on the same streets and proved himself loyal. Younger guys like David Reyes, 19, still living with his mother. Tommy Gonzalez, 18, who'd just become a father and was trying to figure out how to support a baby with no job skills and no prospects. These weren't hardened criminals or cartel enforcers or professional thieves. They were products of a system that had failed them completely. The unwritten rules that had governed the South Side for decades were simple. Everyone had their territory. You didn't cross certain boundaries without permission. You didn't steal from operations run by established families. You paid taxes to whoever controlled your area. And you never ever touched anything connected to the old Italian families unless you wanted problems that couldn't be solved. These rules weren't written down anywhere. They weren't taught in schools or explained to newcomers. You learned them by growing up in the neighborhood, by watching, by listening to older men who'd survived, by understanding how power actually worked beneath the surface of daily life. But by 1984, whole generations had arrived who didn't know the rules because nobody had taught them. The housing project demolitions had displaced families into neighborhoods where they had no history, no connections, no understanding of invisible boundaries. The old men who might have explained how things worked were dying, or locked up, or had moved to the suburbs. The traditional gang structures that might have enforced territorial agreements had fractured into dozens of smaller crews with no central authority. Everyone was hustling, everyone was desperate, and nobody had time for lessons about respect and codes and old arrangements that seemed meaningless when you couldn't feed your family. Luis Vasquez didn't know Salvatore Moretti. He'd heard the name, knew there was a trucking operation on 35th Street that had been there forever, but he didn't understand what that meant. He didn't know about Giuseppe Moretti arriving from Sicily with $8. Didn't know about the decades of careful relationship building. Didn't know that the Moretti warehouse was protected not by guards or gates, but by reputation built over 60 years. To Luis, the Moretti operation looked like every other warehouse in the district. A building, some trucks, probably moving something valuable. An opportunity. In mid-January 1984, Luis had watched the Moretti warehouse for 3 nights, counting trucks, noting patterns, seeing that security was minimal. One night guard, older guy who walked the perimeter once an hour, then went back inside where it was warm, loading dock doors that could be forced with a crowbar. No sophisticated alarm system, just basic locks that anyone who'd done time knew how to defeat. Luis saw an easy score. What he didn't see was the line he was about to cross, the boundary that existed not in physical space, but in the collective memory of everyone who understood how the South Side really worked. January 28, 1984, was a Saturday night when temperatures dropped to 3 degrees and wind off Lake Michigan made it feel like 20 below. The kind of night when smart people stayed inside, when even the street traffic thinned to almost nothing, when the city felt abandoned except for the desperate and the foolish. Salvatore had left the warehouse at 7 that evening after checking the weekend inventory, a routine he'd followed for 30 years. 3 trucks were loaded for Monday morning deliveries. The office safe held $12,000 in cash for payroll and expenses. And in the back corner of the warehouse, behind legitimate freight, sat 40 cases of cigarettes brought up from Virginia where taxes were lower, each case worth approximately $2,000 on the street. $85,000 total, waiting to be distributed to buyers across the South Side who'd been dealing with Moretti trucking since Sal's father ran the operation. Luis Vasquez and his crew hit the warehouse at 2:15 in the morning. They'd waited until the night guard, an old man named Frank Bellini, who'd worked for the Morettis since 1968, made his hourly round and went back inside the small heated office where he spent most nights reading paperbacks and drinking coffee from a thermos. Miguel Torres forced the loading dock door with a crowbar, while Marcus Washington disabled the basic alarm system. Just cutting wires, nothing sophisticated required. They were inside within 4 minutes. Luis had brought 8 members of his crew for the job. His brother Carlos, Miguel, the Ortiz cousins, Marcus, David Reyes, Tommy Gonzalez, and a kid named Peter Dominguez, 17, who'd begged to be included, who needed money to help his mother with rent. They found the cigarette cases exactly where Luis had spotted them during his surveillance. 40 cases, each one stamped with Virginia tax seals, each one representing pure profit to whoever controlled them. The crew worked quickly, loading cases into 2 stolen vans parked at the dock. They moved with the efficiency of desperation, not professionals, but motivated by need and the belief that this was easy money, that whoever owned this stuff would write it off, that nobody got hurt over cigarettes. They had the vans loaded in 26 minutes. They were gone by 2:45 in the morning, leaving the forced door, the cut alarm wires, and Frank Bellini still reading his paperback in the office, completely unaware that $85,000 had just disappeared. Salvatore got the call at 6:30 Sunday morning. Dominic had arrived early to check on the weekend freight, found the forced door, called his father immediately. By 7, all 3 sons were at the warehouse. By 7:30, they'd inventoried what was missing, just the cigarettes. Nothing else touched, not the cash in the safe, not the legitimate freight, not even the tools and equipment that could have been sold easily. Whoever hit them knew exactly what they were looking for. This wasn't random. This was planned. Salvatore stood in the warehouse that his grandfather had built, looking at the empty space where 40 cases had been stacked, and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not panic, not fear, just a terrible clarity about what this meant. The cigarettes themselves weren't the point. Sal could absorb the financial loss, though $85,000 was significant money even for an operation his size. The point was that someone had looked at Moretti Trucking and decided the risk was acceptable. Someone had crossed into his warehouse, taken his property, and apparently believed there would be no consequences. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about respect. This was about whether the Moretti name still meant something in a neighborhood that seemed to have forgotten everything that used to matter. Salvatore made coffee in the warehouse office, the same cheap pot that had been there since 1973. He sat at his father's old desk, smoked 3 Camels in succession, and thought about what came next. His sons waited in silence. Dominic stood by the window, watching the street. Marco paced, his hands opening and closing into fists. Anthony sat in the corner, looking at the forced door, maybe understanding, before his brothers did, that this moment was going to change everything. By 9 that morning, Salvatore had made his decision. He called Tommy Rizzo, who ran a chop shop on 47th Street and knew everyone who moved stolen goods on the south side. Tommy would find out who'd hit the warehouse. Then Salvatore would find out where they kept his property. And then he would teach a lesson about boundaries that this neighborhood had apparently forgotten. The information came back within 36 hours. Tommy Rizzo had connections with everyone who bought and sold contraband cigarettes, and 40 cases with Virginia tax stamps were distinctive enough that word traveled fast when someone tried to move them. By Monday evening, Rizzo had a name: Luis Vasquez. A small-time crew that operated around 33rd Street, no real organization, just desperate kids trying to make scores. Rizzo gave Salvatore everything. Where Luis lived, where the crew hung out, the names of all 14 members, where they'd stashed the cigarettes in a basement apartment on 31st Street that belonged to Miguel Torres's girlfriend. Rizzo also delivered a message. Everyone on the South Side knew about the Moretti hit now. People were watching to see what Sal would do. If he let this pass, if he accepted the loss and moved on, then the Moretti operation was finished. Other crews would see weakness and opportunity. Within 6 months, the warehouse would be hit again and again until there was nothing left worth protecting. Salvatore called his sons to the warehouse office on Tuesday morning, January 31st. The temperature outside was 9 degrees. Ice covered the windows in crystalline patterns. The office smelled like old coffee and cigarette smoke and decades of deals made in this same room. Sal sat at the desk. Dominic stood to his right. Marco leaned against the wall. Anthony sat across from his father, looking younger than his 25 years. Sal laid out what he knew. 14 guys. The Vasquez crew. Punks who didn't know any better. Who'd seen an opportunity and taken it without understanding what they were stealing from. The cigarettes could be recovered. Rizzo had offered to handle it quietly, break some bones, send a message, get the property back. Everyone could walk away. But that wasn't the question they were here to answer. The question was whether walking away was possible anymore. Whether the message of broken bones would be enough when the entire South Side was watching to see if the Morettis still had teeth. Dominic spoke first, his voice measured and calm like always. They could get the cigarettes back, let word spread that anyone who touched Moretti property, got hurt, move on. It was a business decision. Take the win without escalating into something that brought federal attention. Marco disagreed immediately. This wasn't about business. This was about respect. You let 14 punks steal from you and walk away with broken bones. You might as well paint a target on the warehouse because everyone would know you'd gone soft. Anthony said nothing at first, then quietly suggested they could report the theft to the police, file an insurance claim, handle it legitimately. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 15 seconds, but felt like an hour. Salvatore looked at his youngest son until Anthony looked away. Sal's father had taught him something in this same office back in 1954. There are two kinds of men in this world. Men who get stolen from and accept it because they're afraid of what justice costs. And men who understand that being feared is more valuable than being loved. That reputation is the only currency that matters when you live in a world where the law doesn't protect people like us. Giuseppe had told his son that the moment you let someone take what's yours without paying the full price, you stop being a man worth respecting. You become prey. Salvatore had been 26 years old when his father explained this. The same age Luis Vasquez was now. The same age Salvatore had been when he'd made similar choices that had defined the next 30 years of his life. The decision wasn't really a decision at all. It was recognition of what had to happen, what had always been going to happen, from the moment Luis Vasquez forced that loading dock door. Salvatore outlined the plan in simple terms. They couldn't just hit back at Luis. This needed to be comprehensive, absolute, a statement that would echo through the South Side for the next decade. All 14 members of the crew, everyone who'd been in that warehouse, everyone who'd touched what belonged to the Morettis, everyone who'd decided the risk was acceptable. This wasn't about revenge exactly. This was about reestablishing boundaries, about reminding a neighborhood that had forgotten that some lines still existed, that crossing them still carried consequences the law couldn't protect you from. Marco understood immediately and nodded. Dominic was quiet for a long moment, then asked the practical questions about timing and method and disposal. Anthony sat very still, maybe understanding for the first time what his father actually was, beneath the morning coffee rituals and the legitimate business face. The setup took 4 days of careful planning. Salvatore needed all 14 crew members in one location at the same time, needed them contained, needed it done in a way that wouldn't immediately point back to Moretti Trucking. The solution came from understanding desperation. Luis Vasquez and his crew had just scored $85,000 in cigarettes, but moving that kind of volume took time and carried risk. They'd sold maybe a third of it by early February, which meant they were sitting on $50,000 in stolen merchandise that was becoming more dangerous to hold every day that passed. Dominic made the approach through an intermediary, a fence named Carlos Mendez, who did business with everyone and was trusted by people who shouldn't have trusted anyone. Mendez put out word that he had a buyer, someone from out of state who wanted the entire remaining inventory, would pay cash, needed to do the deal on Sunday night, February 5th, at a neutral location. The location Dominic chose was an abandoned warehouse on 39th Street, a massive building that had once housed a furniture manufacturer before the company went bankrupt in 1981. The building had sat empty for 3 years, windows broken, roof partially collapsed, no electricity or heat, scheduled for demolition but stuck in bureaucratic limbo. The building covered an entire city block, 3 stories of empty factory, space and machinery left to rust. More importantly, it was isolated. No residential buildings nearby. No traffic at night. No witnesses. The warehouse had only 2 ways in, a loading dock on the south side and a personnel door on the north. Both could be secured from the outside. The windows were too high to reach, maybe 15 feet off the ground on the first floor, and most were already barred from when the building had been operational. Mendez delivered the message. The buyer would meet them at 8 o'clock Sunday night. Bring all the remaining cigarettes. The money would be waiting. Luis bought it because he needed to. Holding stolen merchandise worth $50,000 in a basement apartment was becoming untenable. Miguel Torres's girlfriend was getting nervous. Tommy Gonzalez needed cash for his baby. David Reyes owed money to dealers who weren't patient about collection. The offer was too good to question too carefully. Cash deal, no credit. Move the entire inventory at once. Be done with the risk. Luis told his entire crew. Sunday night. Everyone needed to be there for security, to help load the cases, to make sure nobody got robbed during the handoff. 14 guys, 2 vans with the cigarettes, meeting at the abandoned warehouse on 39th at 8 o'clock sharp. Sunday, February 5th, 1984, was the coldest night of that winter. Temperature at sunset was 4 degrees, dropping to 0 by 8 o'clock. Wind chill made it feel like 25 below. The sky was clear, Moon 3/4 full, stars sharp and bright in air so cold it hurt to breathe. The city felt crystalline, frozen, silent except for the wind howling through empty buildings. Luis arrived at the warehouse at 7:50 with his entire crew. 2 vans, loaded with cigarette cases, everyone nervous but excited because $50,000 was enough to change all their lives, enough to get out of the basement apartments and the projects, enough to believe for a moment that they'd beaten the system that had been beating them their entire lives. They pulled around to the loading dock on the south side like Mendez had instructed. The big rolling door was open maybe 3 feet, just enough to drive the vans inside. Miguel went first, checking the interior with a flashlight. Empty, except for old machinery and debris. No sign of buyers yet, but they were early. The crew waited in the vans, engine running for heat, watching the street, ready to move fast if this turned into a robbery. At exactly 8 o'clock, 3 vehicles pulled up. Black Cadillac, 2 pickup trucks. Salvatore Moretti stepped out of the Cadillac with his 3 sons. No weapons visible, hands in coat pockets. 4 men approaching 14. But the Vasquez crew wasn't worried because numbers favored them. And this was supposed to be business. Luis got out of the van to meet them. Maybe he recognized Salvatore. Maybe he'd seen him around the neighborhood, an old man who ran a trucking company? No threat? Or maybe Luis never got a good look because Dominic moved first. Not to attack, just to motion everyone inside where it was warmer, where they could see the merchandise better, where the money was supposedly waiting. And Luis, desperate and greedy, and believing this was finally something going right, led his entire crew through that loading dock door into the darkness of the abandoned warehouse. The last member of the Vasquez crew entered the warehouse at 8:04. Peter Dominguez, 17 years old, carrying a case of cigarettes, following his friends into the cavernous space where moonlight came through broken windows and their breath formed clouds in the freezing air. The moment Peter crossed the threshold, Marco Moretti slammed the rolling door shut. The sound echoed through the empty building like a gunshot. Luis Vasquez spun around, suddenly understanding, reaching for a pistol he kept in his waistband. But Dominic already had a shotgun leveled at him. Anthony stood by the personnel door on the north side with a revolver. Sal stood in the center of the warehouse floor, backlit by moonlight, looking at 14 young men who just realized they weren't leaving. For perhaps 10 seconds, nobody moved. The Vasquez crew understood they'd been trapped, but didn't yet understand why. This could still be a robbery. The Morettis taking back their cigarettes and maybe teaching a lesson with fists and baseball bats. Luis started talking fast. They'd give back everything. The cigarettes, the money they'd made from selling the rest. Whatever this was about, they could work it out. Marcus Washington tried to run for the loading dock door. Marco clubbed him with the shotgun barrel, dropped him unconscious. The sound of Marcus hitting the concrete floor changed the energy from confused fear to pure terror. The younger guys, Tommy, David, Peter, started backing toward the walls, hands up, begging, trying to explain they'd just been following Luis. They hadn't known whose warehouse they were hitting. Salvatore spoke then, his voice calm and flat, and carrying through the frozen warehouse. He told them exactly whose cigarettes they'd stolen, explained that Moretti Trucking had been in this neighborhood since 1923, told them his father's name, his grandfather's name, the history they'd violated by forcing that loading dock door. He said that stealing the cigarettes had been a mistake, but a mistake that could have been forgiven, apologized for, paid back. What couldn't be forgiven was the disrespect. The assumption that the Moretti name meant nothing, that boundaries didn't exist, that consequences were optional. Sal told them that everyone on the South Side was watching this situation, waiting to see if the old codes still mattered or if everything was chaos now. And he told them, in the same calm voice, that he was sorry, but this was the price of their education. The Morettis had brought 5-gallon cans of gasoline. 6 cans total, 30 gallons. Dominic had scouted the warehouse 3 days earlier, identified the ventilation shafts, the places where accelerant could be poured to ensure maximum spread. They'd chained both doors from the outside before entering. Heavy logging chains and master locks, impossible to break without tools nobody in the Vasquez crew was carrying. The windows were too high to reach even if you stacked debris. The building was concrete and brick, wouldn't burn completely, but the interior was full of old wood and paper debris and would go up fast once ignited. The Morettis had planned this systematically, coldly, with the same attention to detail Giuseppe had taught his son when explaining how to run a business. You don't leave loose ends. You don't create problems for yourself later. You do what needs to be done, and you do it completely. Luis rushed Salvatore as Marco began pouring gasoline. The boy was brave or stupid or desperate enough to try fighting 4 armed men. Dominic shot him in the leg with the shotgun, not to kill but to immobilize. Luis went down screaming. The rest of the crew scattered into the darkness of the warehouse, climbing on machinery, hiding behind pillars, looking for exits that didn't exist. The Morettis poured gasoline in patterns across the floor, along the walls, soaking piles of old wooden pallets and cardboard that would catch and spread. They worked without speaking, a family operation, everyone knowing their role. Anthony was crying while he poured, but he poured. Dominic was methodical, making sure coverage was complete. Marco moved fastest, wanting this finished. Salvatore supervised, watching the trapped crew, making sure nobody escaped in the confusion. When the 30 gallons were distributed, the Morettis moved toward the personnel door. The Vasquez crew understood what was about to happen, and the screaming began in earnest. 14 voices, some praying, some cursing, some begging, some silent. Salvatore took one last look at Luis Vasquez, bleeding on the concrete floor, meeting his eyes. Sal said quietly that this was mountain justice. This was what happened when you forgot the rules. The first match was struck at 8:23 on the night of February 5th, 1984. Dominic dropped it through a ventilation grate near the loading dock. The gasoline caught instantly, a whoosh of ignition that sent flames racing across the warehouse floor in branching rivers of fire. Within 30 seconds, the interior was bright as daylight, flames climbing the walls, consuming the old wood and debris like it had been waiting 60 years for this moment. The Morettis stood outside the chained personnel door, watching through a gap in the metal. Inside, The Vasquez crew ran toward the loading dock, found it chained, tried to force it, failed. They ran to the personnel door, threw themselves against it, screamed for mercy that wasn't coming. The smoke rose fast, thick black, clouds that filled the upper reaches of the building first, then descended. The windows were too high and too narrow. Miguel Torres tried stacking machinery to reach one, made it halfway, before smoke overwhelmed him. He fell 12 feet onto concrete. The Ortiz cousins stayed together until the end, Rafael holding Jose while both choked on smoke so thick you couldn't see 3 feet. Carlos Vasquez, Luis's younger brother, found a corner where flames hadn't reached yet, curled into a ball, and died from smoke inhalation before the fire could touch him. Marcus Washington, already unconscious from Marco's blow, never woke up. Tommy Gonzalez, who'd become a father 6 weeks earlier, screamed his daughter's name until his lungs filled with smoke. David Reyes tried to break through a brick wall with his bare hands. Peter Dominguez, 17, called for his mother. The youngest and the oldest, the strong and the weak, all equal in fire. By 8:35, the screaming had stopped. The building burned with a roar that could be heard 6 blocks away. Neighbors called the fire department. Engine Company 19 arrived at 8:42, found a 3-story warehouse fully engulfed, flames shooting through the roof. Captain Dennis O'Malley ordered his men to establish a perimeter and let it burn. The building was abandoned, scheduled for demolition anyway, and no firefighter was going inside that inferno. They poured water on adjacent buildings to prevent spread, but the warehouse they let consume itself. The fire burned for 4 hours. By midnight, only the brick shell remained, smoking and glowing with internal heat. The roof had collapsed completely. The interior was ash and twisted metal, and 14 bodies burned beyond recognition. Chicago Fire Department investigators arrived at dawn. What they found turned a routine investigation into a homicide case within minutes. The chain doors still intact, chains blackened but holding. The gasoline cans melted but identifiable near the personnel entrance, the bodies clustered near the exits, clearly trying to escape. This wasn't accidental, this was deliberate, methodical, premeditated murder. By 9 a.m, Chicago Police Department Homicide Division had taken over the scene. By noon, the medical examiner had begun the process of identifying 14 bodies through dental records because there wasn't enough left to use any other method. Detective Raymond Walsh caught the case at 7 a.m. on February 6th. 22 years with Chicago PD, 15 in homicide. He'd seen every kind of death the city could produce. But standing in the still smoking ruins of that warehouse, looking at 14 body bags being loaded into the medical examiner's van, Walsh knew this was different. This was execution. The chains told the story clearly. Someone had trapped 14 people inside, poured accelerant, and burned them alive. The forensic team found gasoline residue in multiple locations, found the ventilation grate where ignition had started, found tool marks on the door chains, showing they'd been secured from outside. This wasn't gang violence in the usual sense. This was calculated, planned, cold. Identification took 3 days. Dental records eventually gave names to all 14 victims: Luis Vasquez, Carlos Vasquez, Miguel Torres, the Ortiz cousins, Marcus Washington, Tommy Gonzalez, David Reyes, Peter Dominguez. 6 others, all young men between 17 and 26, all with addresses on the South Side, all with minor criminal records. Walsh started interviewing families, looking for connections, trying to understand why 14 guys from the same crew would all be in an abandoned warehouse together. Carlos Mendez, the fence who'd arranged the meeting, disappeared for 2 weeks before Walsh tracked him down. Under pressure, Mendez admitted he'd been the intermediary. Someone had wanted the Vasquez crew gathered in one location. Mendez gave the name, reluctantly, Dominic Moretti. The investigation moved fast after that. Walsh knew the Moretti family by reputation, knew Salvatore had connections, knew the trucking business was probably a front, but the operation had always been quiet, professional, no violence. Walsh pulled the warehouse burglary report from January 28th. 85,000 in cigarettes stolen from Moretti Trucking. Suddenly the math was simple. Vasquez crew steals from the Morettis. 2 weeks later, entire crew dies in a fire. Walsh brought Dominic Moretti in for questioning on February 15th. Dominic lawyered up immediately, said nothing. But Walsh didn't need a confession. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming. The stolen cigarettes linked motive. Mendez linked planning. Physical evidence at the scene. Gasoline cans that were eventually traced to a supplier in Bridgeport who remembered selling them to a guy matching Marco Moretti's description. On February 23rd, Chicago PD arrested all 4 Morettis: Salvatore, Dominic, Marco, and Anthony. Federal prosecutors took the case because arson resulting in death crossed into federal jurisdiction. The trial started in September 1984. The prosecution presented their case methodically. The theft established motive. The fence established premeditation. The physical evidence established method. The defense argued reasonable doubt, claimed the Morettis were being targeted because of their Italian heritage, because the city needed someone to blame for a tragedy that could have been accidental. But the chains made accident impossible. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. 14 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of conspiracy, multiple counts of arson. Salvatore Moretti received life without parole. His 3 sons received the same. Federal prison, separated into different facilities to prevent them from maintaining their organization. The Moretti family disintegrated within a year. Rosa was already dead. Maria, the daughter who'd married the lawyer and moved to the suburbs, filed for divorce in 1985 when her husband's firm made it clear that being a Moretti was career poison. She changed her name back to her married name, moved to Arizona, cut all contact with Chicago. Dominic's wife, Angela, filed for divorce. 6 months into his sentence, took their 2 daughters and moved to Michigan. The girls grew up knowing their father was serving life for mass murder, carrying that weight through school, through college, through every relationship. Marco's girlfriend Teresa disappeared, never visited, never wrote. Anthony never married Marie. The engagement ended before the trial concluded. She married someone else in 1986. The Moretti trucking warehouse was seized by federal authorities as part of the prosecution. The building sat empty for 2 years before being sold at auction to a development company that tore it down in 1987. Today it's a parking lot, cracked asphalt and weeds, completely unmarked, except by those who remember. The house on 33rd Street where Salvatore had lived since 1952 was foreclosed in 1985, when nobody could make the mortgage payments. A family from Indiana bought it at auction, knew nothing of its history, lived there for 8 years before moving. The neighborhood itself changed after the fire. For a few months, disputes were settled quietly. Nobody wanted to be the next cautionary tale. But the change wasn't permanent. Within 2 years, new crews had moved in. The old codes were forgotten again. Violence returned. The Vasquez families buried their dead that February in Mount Greenwood Cemetery. 14 funerals over 6 days. Luis's mother, Elena, collapsed at the graveside and never fully recovered. She died in 1990, 54 years old, her heart simply giving up under the weight of burying both her sons in the same week. Carlos Vasquez left behind a girlfriend who'd been 3 months pregnant, a daughter born in August 1984 who grew up knowing her father only through photographs and the story of how he died screaming in fire. Miguel Torres's girlfriend, the one whose basement had held the stolen cigarettes, blamed herself, developed PTSD, attempted suicide twice before finally succeeding in 1987. The Ortiz family lost both their sons in one night. The parents moved back to Puerto Rico within a year, unable to live in the neighborhood where their children had burned. Tommy Gonzalez's daughter grew up without a father, raised by her teenage mother in a system that provided no support for the families of victims who were also criminals. Marcus Washington's mother became an activist, speaking at schools about gang violence, about codes of honor that got young men killed, about poverty and desperation, and choices that seemed reasonable until fire reduced them to ash. Peter Dominguez's mother never recovered from losing her son at 17. She kept his room exactly as he'd left it, his clothes still in the closet, his school books still on the desk. She died in 2009, having never changed a thing. The trauma rippled through generations. Children grew up without fathers. Mothers buried sons. Communities learned and forgot and learned again that violence only creates more violence. Detective Raymond Walsh retired from Chicago PD in 2006 after 39 years of service. In a 2019 podcast interview about the Moretti case, he said something that captured the entire tragedy. Legally, there was no question. 4 men had murdered 14 others with premeditation and planning, locked them in a warehouse and burned them alive. That's evil by any definition. But morally, it's more complicated. The Vasquez crew had stolen from people who'd spent 60 years building a reputation on never accepting disrespect. They'd crossed a line they didn't know existed because nobody had taught them where it was. The Morettis responded with the only language they knew, the code their father and grandfather had followed, the mountain justice that said some violations demanded absolute answers. Both sides were following rules. The rules just contradicted each other. And 14 families on one side and 1 family on the other paid the price. Salvatore Moretti died in federal prison in 2003, 75 years old, having served 19 years of his life sentence. He never expressed remorse, never granted interviews, simply did his time in silence. the same way he'd done everything in his life. Dominic died in 2012, heart attack at 60. Marco is still alive, 73 now, still in federal prison in Pennsylvania. Anthony was released in 2020 after serving 36 years when his sentence was commuted due to health issues. He lives in Indiana under a different name. He's never spoken publicly about what happened. The Moretti story has no heroes. It has a father who valued respect more than 14 human lives, and it has 14 young men who made one catastrophic mistake, stealing from the wrong people at the wrong time. It has a system that failed at every level, an economy that abandoned working-class Chicago, creating desperation that made crime seem like the only option, housing policies that displaced communities, breaking old structures without building new ones. A neighborhood where codes replaced law because law had never protected people in the first place. Was Salvatore Moretti a murderer? Yes. He killed 14 people with premeditation, locked them in a building and burned them alive, without trial, without mercy, without considering that some of them were teenagers who'd simply followed older guys into catastrophe. Was he also a desperate man trying to maintain the only thing he had left, his reputation, in a world that was changing so fast he couldn't adapt? Also, yes. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. 40 years have passed since that February night. The warehouse district where the Morettis once operated is mostly gone now, replaced by condominiums and craft breweries and young professionals who know nothing about the blood that soaked that ground. The parking lot where Moretti Trucking once stood has no plaque, no memorial, no indication that this was where 4 generations of one family's work ended in federal prison. Life continues as it always does, relentless and forgetful. If this story made you think about honor, respect, and the price we pay when old codes collide with new realities, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong. Comment below. What would you have done in Salvatore's position? Where do you draw the line between protecting your reputation and becoming a monster? Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One stolen shipment, one forgotten code, one desperate decision at a time.